Matthew Whitaker, U.S. Ambassador to NATO, to discuss all of it. Great to see you, Ambassador.
Hey, Bianca. Good to be with you.
All right, we're hearing 3.0. It definitely clearly signals a new chapter, a new framework. Talk to us about some of the changes that you think are most immediate and most important. Obviously, President Trump has been driving this for a long time to create a lot of changes with this alliance.
Because of President Trump's leadership, Bianca, we are now on a new trajectory here at NATO. Our European allies are taking over the conventional defense of the European continent. And I think that's good for the American taxpayers. It actually creates jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's not just a political promise like the Wales Pledge, where everybody agreed to spend 2% of GDP in 2014 after the Russian annexation of Crimea. What's happening now is in last year at The Hague, we agreed to 5% of GDP on defense and defense-related items, and we had our first report card in Ankara a month ago at the summit, and that report card was good. $139 billion more spent by our European and Canadian allies here at NATO on defense. That's good. $60 billion spent in the U.S. on U.S. equipment and ammunition. So this is an extraordinary good news story. All the credit obviously goes to President Trump and his leadership. And no longer, for 77 years, our NATO allies have taken advantage of the United States' strength, but now we're going to be all equally strong.
Yeah. And in addition to the monetary changes, there's also been a focus on the priorities. They say the United States will focus on Indo-Pacific region. And, when you look at that, China, Japan, Philippines, why is that now a priority? The U.S. is kind of zeroing in on that, Ambassador.
President Trump issued his national security strategy at the beginning of his presidency. That was followed on by the national defense strategy, which made the priorities very clear. That is that the defense of the homeland is number one, defense of the American people. The Western Hemisphere, where we live, obviously equally important as the second priority. Pacific region and the first island chain, the next priority, and then our alliance here in defending Europe is also a priority, but it's in fourth place. And what we need is, in order to be strong and globally project power, we need allies that are equally strong. And that's what President Trump clearly identified, and that's what we're executing here every single day at NATO. And it's really, I think right now, it's probably the biggest foreign policy victory of the second Trump term, but the work has just begun. But so far, positive momentum on that project, and it's an exciting moment in the history of NATO, really.
So, and obviously with President Xi of China coming in September, strategic conversations will be happening as well here in the United States. I want to ask you about NATO member Turkey. Obviously, President Trump has hosted President Erdogan here, and they have a pretty strong relationship, as you just mentioned. Ankara hosting the NATO summit last night. What role did they have in NATO 3.0? Obviously, there's talk about them with the F-35s. But there's also, a lot of chatter about, how sometimes Erdogan can play both sides of the fence here.
Yeah, Turkey is a strong and capable ally. They have the second largest military in NATO, next to the United States. The Germans are going to start competing with them for that title, and they're anchoring a very important region of NATO territory in the southeast. That being said, they also have a very capable and important defense industry that can produce ships and ammunition and the things that NATO allies need. And I've spent a lot of time in Turkey, not only at the summit, but the month before the summit, I went down and really toured every corner, both our U.S. force presence in Turkey, but also watched Turkish military exercises. So, Turkey's a great ally, good friends. They work very hard here at NATO. We have a great ambassador in Turkey, and I really think that things are in a good place. But the most important thing, obviously, is the president-to-president relationship that President Trump has with President Erdogan.
You know, you're doing a lot of work there at NATO for the United States. In fact, Matt, you just went to Iceland to talk to NATO forces, how they're securing the Arctic. I mean, such a vast area. We're showing some of the images here. What can you share with us about the critical nature of that being a place where NATO is prepared to secure, to train?
Yeah, it is so important. And, you know, Iceland sits in the middle of the North Atlantic, and this is called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization for a reason. It's to cover and defend that area. And Iceland sits also in a very important GIUK gap where it's the last place ultimately that things like Russian strategic bombers and nuclear armed submarines can be identified and followed. And so, you know, Iceland is critical. I was there for a military exercise I attended with the Supreme Allied Commander. And what I saw is the United States, obviously, because of our bilateral relationship and our defense agreement with Iceland, is very serious about that situation and what we do up there. And we had NATO allies there exercising together because they understand the critical importance of that region as well.
Information. Truth is freedom. Is Newsmax. It's real news for real people.